Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to the life and work of the great Willa Cather. Cather, the great American writer. Notice your dates on 651, 1873 to 1947. Cather, known for at least two things. Let's write this down really quickly. Two things about her so important. One, she is one of the great voices of the Nebraska Plains. She lives there for much of her life. She writes most of her stuff set in this area of the Midwest, especially Nebraska, telling us so much about what America is like at the turn of the century on the American plains, letting us know the challenges of what it's like to not only be a woman, but to be a frontierswoman, right? Living out there on the Nebraska plains. The second thing that we want to point out about Cather is that she is a brilliant creator of character and her relationship between character and setting. I would write that down. On page 651, she does become a literary giant. Notice the last paragraph. 35 years, Cather produces 10 novels, 2 short story collections, 2 collections of essays. Her outstanding works, I would write some of these titles down at 3A. O Pioneers, Matinee, sometimes read and assigned at the junior level. Notice Matinee is 1918. One of Ours, 1922, all of which capture the flavor of life on the Midwestern prairie. One of Ours, you might make a note, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1923. Then Cather will shift her attention to New Mexico. Death Comes for the Archbishop, 17th century Canada, as well as going to be the focus of Shadows on the Rock in 1931. She is a prolific writer, and because we live in Wyoming, we live very close to where she lived in Nebraska, and so much of the themes are going to be shared that are similar. We're going to be looking now at her short story, A Wagner Matinee, and I'm with you on page 653. At 2B, I hope that you've already written down off of 650, the characterization as the literary analysis, direct and indirect characterization. Of course, indirect characterization will be that information we learn about the character, not directly, but rather indirectly. And Cather, again, is just brilliant at constructing these characters. Let's go ahead and look at the background information really quickly on 653. When A Wagner Matinee first appeared in 1904, I'd write that down, 1904, Cather's readers would have been as familiar with Richard Wagner as people are today with the Beatles. Wagner, who was German, was one of the 19th century's great composers. His operas are characterized by adventurous harmonic language and an innovative intermarriage of music and drama. To many, Wagner represents the idea of high culture. In this story, Cather contrasts the stark realities of frontier life with life in a more cultured world. I would write this down at level 1 so that it begins to make some sense to you. This is a story about 2 worlds. It is the story of the world of the city versus the world of the frontier. And as we hear our story now unfold, we're going to watch a woman who has lived in both worlds. Cather is going to make a lot of hay, no pun intended, on the idea that you are where you live, and you are, to some degree, the person you are because of where you live, your environment. And there is a difference between growing up living out, for example, in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, and living, for example, in the middle of a city. A Wagner Matinee. Let's go ahead now. At level 1, we'll listen to our professional reader read for us as we go through now the process of annotating at level 1, summarizing the events. Here we go. A Wagner Matinee.
A Wagner Matinee by Willa Cather. I received one morning a letter written in pale ink on glassy blue-lined notepaper and bearing the postmark of a little Nebraska village. This communication, worn and rubbed, looking as though it had been carried for some days in a coat pocket that was none too clean, was from my Uncle Howard. It informed me that his wife had been left a small legacy by a bachelor relative who had recently died, and that it had become necessary for her to come to Boston to attend to the settling of the estate. He requested me to meet her at the station and render her whatever services might prove necessary. On examining the date indicated as that of her arrival, I found it no later than tomorrow. He had characteristically delayed writing until, had I been away from home for a day, I must have missed the good woman altogether. The name of my Aunt Georgiana called up not alone her own figure, at once pathetic and grotesque, but opened before my feet a gulf of recollection so wide and deep that, as the letter dropped from my hand, I felt suddenly a stranger to all the present conditions of my existence, wholly ill at ease and out of place amid the surroundings of my study. I became, in short, the gangling farmer boy my aunt had known, scourged with chilblains and bashfulness, my hands cracked and raw from the corn husking. I felt the knuckles of my thumb tentatively, as though they were raw again. I sat again before her parlor organ, thumbing the scales with my stiff red hands, while she beside me made canvas mittens for the huskers. The next morning, after preparing my landlady somewhat, I set out for the station. When the train arrived, I had some difficulty in finding my aunt. She was the last of the passengers to alight, and when I got her into the carriage, she looked not unlike one of those charred, smoked bodies that firemen lift from the debris of a burned building.
All right, so we want to pause for a moment and make a quick observation. Our narrator is living in Boston, which, by the way, is a long way from Nebraska. He has been told that his aunt is coming to visit, Georgiana. His aunt is going to arrive, and right away, our speaker, our narrator, who now lives in Boston, grew up, of course, out in the plains, but now lives in Boston, is going to begin to describe his aunt. She is not a person who would look like she grew up in the city of Boston. She is going to look quite different, which begs a really interesting question. Are people who live out in the West fundamentally different people than people who live back east? We'll continue. Make sure you're following it along.
She had come all the way in a day coach. Her linen duster had become black with soot, and her black bonnet gray with dust during the journey. When we arrived at my boarding house, the landlady put her to bed at once, and I did not see her again until the next morning. Whatever shock Mrs. Springer experienced at my aunt's appearance, she considerately concealed. Myself, I saw my aunt's misshapen figure with that feeling of awe and respect with which we behold explorers who have left their ears and fingers north of Franz Joseph Land, or their health somewhere along the Upper Congo. My Aunt Georgiana had been a music teacher at the Boston Conservatory somewhere back in the latter 60s. One summer, which she had spent in a little village in the Green Mountains where her ancestors had dwelt for generations, she had kindled the callow fancy of the most idle and shiftless of all the village lads, and had conceived for this Howard Carpenter one of those absurd and extravagant passions which a handsome country boy of 21 sometimes inspires in a plain, angular, spectacled woman of 30. When she returned to her duties in Boston, Howard followed her, and the upshot of this inexplicable infatuation was that she eloped with him, eluding the reproaches of her family and the criticism of her friends by going with him to the Nebraska frontier.
Okay, so let's write it down at level 1. We learned something about this aunt. She actually lived in Boston. She was a city girl, but she fell in love with a country boy. She elopes with him. What does that mean? Write down, what does it mean to elope? Right, you get married without approval of your parents, and the minute she falls in love with him, he says, the guy was kind of different. He was from the country. He was a cowboy. He was young and handsome. She may be not so good looking herself, a little bit older. She falls in love. They get married, and out they go to Nebraska, middle of nowhere, where she was going to try and make a life for herself. Now again, you want to write down at level 1, what is it that she did? She's a music teacher, which will in some ways already begin to set us up for this title, Wagner Matinee.
Carpenter, who of course had no money, took a homestead in Red Willow County, 50 miles from the railroad. There they measured off their 80 acres by driving across the prairie in a wagon, to the wheel of which they had tied a red cotton handkerchief, and counting its revolutions. They built a dugout on the red hillside, one of those cave dwellings whose inmates usually reverted to the conditions of primitive savagery. Their water they got from the lagoons where the buffalo drank, and their slender stock of provisions was always at the mercy of bands of roving Indians. For 30 years, my aunt had not been farther than 50 miles from the homestead.
Whoa, so we want to write this down really quickly. So out she goes to the middle of nowhere. The first house that they live in is a house that's dug. Some of us have actually seen this. If you've driven around Wyoming, you've seen this, where they would just find like a hill and they would just carve out part of the hill, and you lived inside of that hill in what was called a dugout. That was your house. Where did they get their water from? From where the buffalo went down to get a drink. Whoa, so she goes from living in Boston in this really nice place all the way out to the middle of nowhere, living in the worst of conditions, and she has done it for 30 years now. We want to write that down. So when she comes back to Boston, this is the first time she's been back in 30 years. I wonder if she's a little bit changed. I'm at the top of page 655. You will do much better studying Willa Cather if you follow very closely word for word. She is a woman who, as a writer, appreciates the beauty of dense language. So the closer you follow the language, the better the understanding will be for you. Let's keep going.
But Mrs. Springer knew nothing of all this, and must have been considerably shocked at what was left of my kinswoman. Beneath the soiled linen duster, which on her arrival was the most conspicuous feature of her costume, she wore a black stuff dress whose ornamentation showed that she had surrendered herself unquestioningly into the hands of a country dressmaker. My poor aunt's figure, however, would have presented astonishing difficulties to any dressmaker. Her skin was yellow from constant exposure to a pitiless wind, and to the alkaline water which transforms the most transparent cuticle into a sort of flexible leather. She wore ill-fitting false teeth. The most striking thing about her physiognomy, however, was an incessant twitching of the mouth and eyebrows, a form of nervous disorder resulting from isolation and monotony, and from frequent physical suffering.
We should point out, physiognomy means her face. This is a woman who has the prairie and the frontier stamped on her body. Her skin is tough like leather. She has false teeth that don't fit very well. She's dressed in this dress that clearly was made by some kind of country dressmaker. In every single way, she does not fit in now with Boston high society, right? Okay? And of course, it's going to make it fascinating then when she goes to the show.
In my boyhood, this affliction had possessed a sort of horrible fascination for me, of which I was secretly very much ashamed. For in those days, I owed to this woman most of the good that ever came my way, and had a reverential affection for her.
He loved her as a boy.
During the 3 winters when I was riding herd for my uncle, my aunt, after cooking 3 meals for half a dozen farmhands, and putting the 6 children to bed, would often stand until midnight at her ironing board, hearing me at the kitchen table beside her recite Latin declensions and conjugations, and gently shaking me when my drowsy head sank down over a page of irregular verbs. It was to her, at her ironing or mending, that I read my first Shakespeare, and her old textbook of mythology was the first that ever came into my empty hands. She taught me my scales and exercises, too.
Let's just pause for a moment and point out that this woman, who he has not seen for a long time, back from the prairie, that this woman was his teacher. She was the one that introduced him to Shakespeare, to Latin, to music. In other words, she is this city woman who moves out to Nebraska. She's a tough worker. She makes the meal for all the men, takes care of all of the children, and then stands at the ironing board until midnight, doing all of the housework, while he is also being taught by her how to learn the language, the dead language, Latin. You can get a sense that he has grown up to now be an intellectual, living a city life in Boston. And his first look at her is kind of like, ugh, she's from the country. And in every way, clearly from the country. And yet he's reminiscing about what an influence she had in his life. A tremendous influence. Let's keep reading.
On the little parlor organ which her husband had bought her after 15 years, during which she had not so much as seen any instrument, except an accordion, that belonged to one of the Norwegian farmhands. She would sit beside me by the hour, darning and counting, while I struggled with the harmonious blacksmith. But she seldom talked to me about music, and I understood why. She was a pious woman. She had the consolation of religion, and to her at least, her martyrdom was not wholly sordid. Once, when I had been doggedly beating out some passages from an old score of Georgiana I had found among her music books, she came up to me, and putting her hands over my eyes, gently drew my head back upon her shoulder, saying tremulously, "Don't love it so well, Clark, or it may be taken from you. Oh, dear boy, pray that whatever your sacrifice be, it is not that."
Top of page 656.
When my aunt appeared on the morning after her arrival, she was still in a semi-somnambulant state. She seemed not to realize that she was in the city where she had spent her youth, the place longed for hungrily for half a lifetime. She had been so wretchedly train-sick throughout the journey that she had no recollection of anything but her discomfort, and to all intents and purposes, there were but a few hours of nightmare between the farm in Red Willow County and my study on Newbury Street. I had planned a little pleasure for her that afternoon, to repay her for some of the glorious moments she had given me when we used to milk together in the straw-thatched cowshed, and she, because I was more than usually tired, or because her husband had spoken sharply to me, would tell me of the splendid performance of Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots she had seen in Paris in her youth. At 2 o'clock, the Boston Symphony Orchestra was to give a Wagner program, and I intended to take my aunt, though as I conversed with her, I grew doubtful about her enjoyment of it. Indeed, for her own sake, I could only wish her taste for such things quite dead, and the long struggle mercifully ended at last. I suggested our visiting the conservatory and the common before lunch, but she seemed altogether too timid to wish to venture out. She questioned me absently about various changes in the city, but she was chiefly concerned that she had forgotten to leave instructions about feeding half-skimmed milk to a certain weakling calf. "Old Maggie's calf, you know, Clark," she explained, evidently having forgotten how long I had been away. She was further troubled because she had neglected to tell her daughter about the freshly opened kit of mackerel in the cellar that would spoil if it were not used directly.
Note the irony. For 30 years now, she's lived out in the frontier. So when she comes back to the city, two things. One, for level one, she gets sick on the train ride. This is a woman who can outwork any man in Boston, but she gets sick on the train ride coming back. She doesn't like the movement. She hadn't been on a train very much. And then secondly, when she is in Boston, the city she lived in as a kid, she traveled to Paris, she was very cultured, but now that she's back in Boston, all she can think about is back home. Some silly thing like who's going to take care of some little cow that needs to be milked or something like that. Hey, at 3B, if you've got a person in your life like this who is way more interested in being back at the homestead, or back where she comes from or he comes from, you already have a sense of this. So you've got a story now that's set up where you have a desire for him to kind of give her a little bit of joy. And the way he's going to do this is by asking her to go with him to a 2 o'clock showing for the Boston Philharmonic Symphony, right? For the Boston Symphony Orchestra, right? And they're going to watch a presentation by this composer, Wagner. So we're now kind of set up, the story is set up, and for the rest of the story now, we're going to have this experience where he will hear from his aunt a story that he didn't know. And it's going to be a fascinating moment in time as he hears about it. We'll come back to the story in a moment. Thank you.